that are going to give us their insight on female strength training. And we also have panelists who are here to read through the questions, and we hope that we can answer questions as we're going today. And at the end, we'll have the Q&A session. So if you come up with questions, you can send them in, and we will be posting them also in there, so that you don't have to worry that if you ask the same question that somebody already has asked. So we're counting down to 0 when we start our webinar, our first ever female focused webinar. Wow, even lifting, I didn't think that 2 minutes was that long, but here we go. Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to International Weightlifting Federation Female Focus Webinar. We're going to offer you a 2-hour set. We have 3 presenters, and then we will do a question and answer Q&A at the end. So if you press the Q&A button, you will be able to ask your question, and then our panelists will go ahead and sort through those questions there. And everyone will be on mute. So if you have something, you will have to contact us through the Q&A. At this moment, I would like to thank you, IWF Interim President Dr. Irani and General Secretary Jalud, for supporting us for this webinar. And then I would like to present the IWF Women's Commission. Can I have the slide? We have Women's Commission. My name is Karoliina Lundahl. I'm from Finland, and I've been the chair since last spring. And we have members, Dr. Heather Allison, Dr. Wafa Musa, Ms. Neroli King, Ms. Lagfa Roussel Odgurel, and Ms. Katarina Peja. Our commission work during these 2 Olympiads from 2013 to 2021, we work on IOC gender equality report recommendations, and sport is one of them, and one of the pillars is sport, and this falls into the coaching area. We have been working with 8 female bodyweight categories. We have worked on getting 2 female executive board members on the board. And our latest work is safeguard and protection policy, which we have passed, but it is not quite yet fully in action, but soon we hope to have that also. There are some noted persons taking part in this webinar who have contributed to the history of women's weightlifting, and I want to thank them for their contributions. Thank you, Zoli. Our panel today, I will be your moderator. So my name is Karoliina. We have Dr. Heather Allison from the Women's Commission. She's joining us from London, and she has been on the Women's Commission for 8 years. Then from New Zealand, Neroli King, and she is a first-time Women's Commission member. Then from Nottingham, England, we have Sarah Davies, and she is the IWF Athletes Commission Chair. And we have an unfortunate cancellation. Pyros Dimas, who has been the Athletes Commission Chair, our athletes rep, for IOC, and he is an executive board member. Unfortunately, has a cancellation for tonight. But we are ready. So our panel will review incoming questions, and then they'll sort them by tagging a presenter's name to it. And then at the end, our presenters have time to answer some of the questions, and there might be a possibility that the rest of the questions will be answered via email. All this time willing. I will not promise anything. If there's thousands of questions, it might be too much. And now, we'll start with our first presenter, PhD candidate Kimberly Santa Barbara, Master of Science, Certified Strength and Conditioning Specialist, and she will lecture to us from Auckland, New Zealand, on the topic Strength Training and Menstrual Cycle. Kimberly, take it away.
Great, thank you so much. I'm gonna just quickly share my screen here. Okay, everyone see that okay? Awesome. Okay, so yes, as was just said, my name is Kimberly Santa Barbara, and I'm a PhD student here in Auckland. I'm specifically looking at the female hormone cycle and that implication with muscle development. So today we'll be going over a little bit of information specifically on the menstrual cycle and hormonal profiles, as well as what that has to do with coaching and strength and resistance training development. Okay, so we're going to go over a lot of graphs that may look kind of intense, especially if this is not something you're looking at regularly, but don't be overwhelmed. We'll go through these. I'll tell you the most important parts that we need to look at. And again, we don't need to memorize this or anything like that. I really want to use these graphs as just a way to have a visual representation of what I'm talking about, so that way we're all on the same point as far as hormones and the menstrual cycle and everything like that, okay? So first part here, this is our average textbook menstrual cycle. So we can see it's 28 days. So with the days at the bottom here, starting with day 1, which is the first day of the period, okay? And then we go all the way through to about the middle of the cycles when we would expect ovulation. So somewhere around day 14 in this 28-day cycle. And then all the way to the end of the cycle, day 28. And then again, it starts back at the beginning, the following cycle. Okay, so first things to note here, the beginning part of the cycle is what we call the follicular phase. Again, we don't need to know a ton of details, but we do need to remember the term follicular phase because we're going to come back to that here in a second. And then the second part here is the luteal phase. Okay, so important things to note is that at the beginning of the follicular phase, we have very low hormones overall. So estrogen and progesterone are low while someone's on their period, because that's essentially what stimulates the beginning of the period. And then as we move through the follicular cycle, the rise in estrogen happens just before ovulation. So overall, follicular phase has a slightly different hormone profile than when we go over into the luteal phase. So the luteal phase, we can see that there's a rise in both progesterone and estrogen. So some people call this also the high hormone phase, essentially because 2 hormones are rising. Okay, so again, not a big deal that we remember how much they raise or what's raising, just remembering beginning part's the follicular phase, later part is the luteal phase. So just a few notes about the average menstrual cycle. So again, we say average cycle is 28 days, but in reality, anywhere from 21 to 35 days, we would consider regular. So again, that's a pretty big difference, a big span of time. And so that's one of the biggest reasons that we'll talk about a lot today, about why there's such a difference in individual characteristics. So that's our first point to talk about, is that for some females, 21 days will be their average cycle, and for some females, 35 days would be their average cycle. So that's a really big difference. If we're talking about a 28-day cycle, we would expect ovulation somewhere near the middle, about day 14, but really this could vary a lot from person to person. Ovulation can happen anywhere from day 7 to day 21, depending on the length of the cycle, as well as some other factors. This will make a difference because when ovulation moves, that also changes which phase the person is in. So if ovulation is at later in the cycle, that means that their follicular phase is longer and their luteal phase would be towards the end of the cycle a little bit different in length. So again, these are all totally normal variations that we see in our regular menstrual cycle. Now, so from person to person, cycle lengths differ. And then within an individual cycle lengths, that can differ as well. So for one female, she could have one cycle that's 21 days, and then the following month, another cycle is 25, 26 days that we would still consider normal. Anywhere from a variation of up to 7 days, we would still consider regular. Again, a lot of variation, right? Just from person to person. Now, of course, if someone is not getting their period anymore, so for more than 3 months, we would consider that amenorrhea. So again, that's when someone is no longer getting a period regularly. Okay, so we just talked about the regular menstrual cycle. So for regular menstruating females. Now, with athletes, we can see in our data that about 50% of athletes use some form of hormonal contraceptives. So it's already half of our athletes are going to have a different hormonal profile, which again is going to be really important when we talk about this concept of training and hormonal profiles, is to understand that we have such different variety from person to person and what sort of hormonal profile that they might have. So this is just a quick graph to give a little visual representation of what different forms of hormonal contraceptives look like in the body. So the first one, that really up and down zigzaggy line, this is the combined oral contraceptive, or what we think of as the normal birth control pill, okay? So that's overall, in most areas of the world, the most common form of hormonal contraceptive that we see used. This up and down zigzaggy line is essentially representing what the hormonal relationship looks like for someone taking that pill. So it looks completely different than what we just saw before. We don't have those up and down curves naturally throughout the cycle, because taking the hormonal contraceptive changes what the natural hormones look like. So this is what the representation of the birth control pill would look like, is essentially each day that someone takes the pill, it causes a rise in their hormones and then a fall until the next day when they take the pill again, and then a fall again. So it goes up and down like that and has those big variations. And then this graph just kind of briefly shows the bottom here, some other forms of hormonal contraceptives, which from country to country, it differs on what options are and what is most popular. The mini pill is a progestin only pill. You can see also creates little spikes, but not as big. The Norplant and Mirena are both things that are implanted in the body, and they have a very much more consistent level of hormones because someone's not taking them each day. But so takeaway from here is that 50% of athletes on average are on some form of hormonal contraceptives, and that it does create a very different hormonal profile than from those who have a natural menstrual cycle. Okay, so moving on. The next type of menstrual cycle to be thinking about is menstrual cycle irregularities. And we think these might be very common in athletes. We don't have a lot of data on this, but what we have seen is it can be anywhere from 10 to 50% of active females have some sort of a cycle irregularity. Now, there's different types of cycle irregularities, and there's different profiles of what these hormones might look like. But some of the known clinical irregularities would be amenorrhea, like we just talked about, so no longer getting a period, and so therefore having a different menstrual cycle. Oligomenorrhea, so having a big wide window of time between periods, so that's greater than 35-day cycles. Endometriosis, PCOS, these are also common things that we see in athletes. There's also subclinical irregularities. So these are ones that the athlete may not even know that they're experiencing. But these are, we'll see in a second, something that does make a difference in their hormonal profile. So these are anovulatory cycles, or essentially a cycle where there's no ovulation, or luteal phase deficiency, which is a cycle where we don't see that rise in progesterone. So we have some graphs to look at here. I swear we're almost done with the graphs. Don't get overwhelmed with these ones. These ones look very technical. But again, I just want to use it to illustrate some of the different profiles that are going on for athletes. So looking in the top left-hand side here, these are just average sedentary females. So these are just our classic textbook menstrual cycle, just like the one we looked at before. So we see that rise in estrogen in the pink line and the rise in progesterone in the blue line. Then going over next to that in the right-hand box is our average cycle for physically active females. So this isn't even necessarily athletes we would qualify them as, just individuals who are working out regularly. We can already see there's a little bit of difference in their cycle. But again, we would expect those cycles to be fairly similar. Then when we go down below in the bottom left-hand side, we're looking at a cycle with luteal phase deficiency. So meaning that they're not getting that same rise in progesterone. And again, the really important thing to just note here is the fact it literally looks different, right? Their hormone profile looks different here, which means that they might have different effects from their hormones than what we'd expect in those graphs above. And then our last graph here is an anovulatory cycle, or a cycle where we don't see the rise in estrogen or progesterone. And again, the main point here is that this athlete has a different hormonal profile than the other athletes, right? They're experiencing different things because they're not seeing that rise in estrogen or that rise in progesterone. But a lot of athletes who have these anovulatory cycles or the luteal phase deficiency, they might not notice this. They might have no idea that this is happening and no idea that this is something to be concerned about. So we know that with these different changes and these different irregularities, that this is common in athletes and that this may have a different effect in what's going on with their individual performance. So moving on. One more category would be the female athlete triad, or RED-S, relative energy deficiency in sport. And this has been talked about quite a bit recently, especially with the commonality that we see this in different types of athletes. Sometimes this is only equated with endurance athletes or marathon type running, but we usually see this a lot actually in weight training and sports where women are strength training. And this is just an important thing to remember because this, again, creates a different hormonal profile. We're not going to go into this super in depth in this conversation, but the main takeaway is that when we see this energy deficiency, it could be from an eating disorder, it could be from changes in diet, calorie restriction, or it could be completely unintentional. It can happen when training volume goes up quite a bit and the athlete just doesn't have the time, energy, or interest in really properly fueling for that amount of training. Okay. And so with that, the first thing we typically see is beginning of irregularity in their menstrual cycle. So something like the oligomenorrhea, where the cycle becomes longer and longer. And eventually then that turns into amenorrhea, where they go at least 3 months without having a period. The reason why this one is important is that we do see that this has direct effects on the athlete's health. Okay. So now that we've gone through all the graphs, now that we have a good idea what's going on, what else happens during the menstrual cycle? So we know that hormones have effects all over the body. So we can see these in everything from someone's mood to someone's appetite to their cognitive function, energy levels. And of course, that makes us wonder, does it affect our athletes' performance? Is this something that we're going to see changing their ability to actually perform on the platform? And one thing to keep in mind is that it's such an individual and different experience, which has a lot to do with the fact that there's so many different types of cycles and so many different hormonal profiles. The other thing that sometimes hormones can be attributed to either being the root cause of everything or having no effect at all. And the reality is it's probably somewhere in the middle. The effect of hormones may cause quite a bit of symptoms and problems for some females, and maybe none at all for others. So it's really hard for us to say across the board that this is something that we see in everyone, or these are symptoms that we see in every single person, because that's just not the case. We see such a huge variety. But in those who do experience symptoms, the most common time for us to see symptoms in our 28-day cycles, remember our standard menstrual cycle, we would see symptoms either in the last week in that luteal phase, especially the end of the luteal phase, or at the beginning of menses or at the start of the period, somewhere around days 1 to 3. Those are the most common times that we will see symptoms if the athlete is experiencing symptoms. There's a huge variety in symptoms that have been associated with the menstrual cycle. Our most common ones, of course, though, are menstrual cramps, decreased energy levels, food cravings, changes in mood, and sleep disruption. But again, there's a lot longer list of different symptoms that athletes may experience at different times. A few across the board changes that we can see in most females are these following ones. So one of the first ones is thermoregulation. That's one that we see, which is the changes in the body's temperature levels. So With the luteal phase, with that second half of the cycle, we do see an increase in someone's body temperature. That's why things like basal body temperature can be used to figure out where a female is in her cycle, is it's using the fact that the body does naturally go up in temperature in the second half of the cycle. For some sports and for some individuals, this by itself may affect their performance to some level, especially if it's not a temperature controlled location, or if there's someone who maybe already overheats quite easily, feels warm easily. This may be something they notice. Other females won't notice the effects of this whatsoever. Appetite changes. So in the luteal phase, the calorie needs for a female does go up. So with progesterone and the rise in that body temperature, we do see someone's calorie needs, their resting basal metabolic rate does start to go up a little bit. And so they might need more calories to fuel themselves during that time. Again, something some females might really notice and really experience, while others might hardly notice at all. This can be what contributes to some people's food cravings, right? Because if our body needs more calories, it makes sense. We're going to crave more food. Changes in body weight, which comes from water retention. Again, this is most commonly seen in the luteal phase and sometimes at the beginning on the onset of menses. And this is, again, totally varying from person to person. Some may show quite large fluctuations in weight and some might not at all. This, of course, is a big deal, though, for weight-based competition. Now, changes in energy sources. This, again, is something that might be seen for some quite a bit and not for others. All this is essentially saying is that in certain parts of the cycle, someone might use carbohydrates slightly different and fat slightly different, depending on where they are in their cycle. And again, this could be connected to someone's food cravings. Okay. So now we finally get to the part that we're all interested in, right? What does this have to do with our athletes' performance and their ability to train? So first we'll talk about performance. We're talking about literally their ability on any given day to do their absolute best, right? So does parts of the menstrual cycle actually affect how someone performs? And the reality is maybe. It's really hard to say because it's, again, very individualized. So thinking back to those graphs, thinking back to that information that we saw before and how different hormonal profiles are, how different individual cycles can be, we know that it's going to be hard to draw a conclusion for all athletes to say that all females will have this problem in their performance at this time. What we can say, though, is that some may notice a big change in their performance. They may have noticed this in themselves, and they may be aware that at certain times they do see a change in their performance. When we look at the research on this topic and we look at what has been, analyzed in the past, which there has been a fair amount of studies done looking at this, but we do have to be cautious with their quality with the studies that were done at that point, because it is quite hard to figure out where someone is on their cycle if we're not using things like blood draws to confirm where they are. And when we look at that across the board, studies have such different information, but what we can see is that individuals do seem to have some level of variation where potentially at the very beginning of the cycle, some athletes may not perform as well as later in the cycle, but it's such a trivial small amount. It's so hard for us to draw any sort of conclusion for that, especially any sort of sweeping conclusion. And then my biggest takeaway that I think is so important is to realize that gold medals have been won at every stage of the menstrual cycle, and they will continue to be done so. So we don't need to be overly concerned with whether or not someone can perform their best due to their menstrual cycle. We know that there's so many other factors that come into play, and that should not be something that in any way slows anyone down. So going on to training, which of course we're able to personalize training a little bit more, right? Performance is going to have probably a fixed date where that needs to happen. Training, we can kind of change and adjust and make work for that individual athlete. You may have seen in social media and in other, books and information, the rise in popularity and the concept of planning your training around the menstrual cycle. So some may claim that this is the only way to train female athletes, that this is absolutely essential for coaches who work with females. And really what the research shows, the actual published research shows, is very, very little information on this. There's only 3 studies that have actually shown this with any sort of sufficient information. And it's just not enough for us to make a broad sweeping generalization that all female athletes need to be trained the same way. We just don't have that information yet. Now, of course, if someone is already using this method and it works well for them, that's fantastic. It's best to do whatever is going to work for that individual athlete. So in the evidence that we have seen around this topic, we do see that the purpose of these sort of studies was to look at increasing training frequency and decreasing training frequency, which may not make the most sense though with some of our athletes' training schedules. But in these studies, what they did look at was decreasing training frequency during the luteal phase and increasing the training frequency during the follicular phase. So at the beginning of the cycle, did show some greater strength and muscle development. But again, this is not well tested, and this was only shown in studies with one leg lower body training. So it's really, really hard for us to understand and know how this will apply to our athletes who are doing full body, high intensity strength training. So again, until there's a lot more information, a lot more research out there, it's unnecessary to say that all athletes need to be trained the same way and that all females will respond the same way to this type of training. Because remember, we have so many different types of hormonal profiles that we see in female athletes. Now, if someone does have symptoms or is aware that their training ability does go down in certain points in their cycle, or they're starting to think that that may be something that they're experiencing, the most important thing to do is to track that information at least for 3 cycles. Have someone, using an app, using a pen and paper to just note when the period starts, when they're getting their symptoms, how long that cycle was. Do it again the next cycle, do it again the next cycle, and look for those strong patterns. Now, when we're looking for the patterns, though, it's really important to also note other things that are happening during that athlete's training cycle. Did they increase volume dramatically? Are they increasing in their intensity? Do we see that they're actually not fueling enough during certain times? Because if these are going on, that either can exacerbate menstrual cycle problems or make it so that it's really hard for us to differentiate what is due to the hormonal profile and what is actually due to other outside factors. So again, as we talked about during the red S section, is that higher training loads without sufficient fueling is not going to create the best environment for our menstrual cycle, right? So if someone is dramatically increasing their training and they're not eating enough, that may be the main cause for symptoms that seem like they're coming from the menstrual cycle. That could also exacerbate the problems or trigger amenorrhea, again, where we no longer are getting a period. So when we think of the menstrual cycle as a method of being able to track someone's health, we can essentially call the menstrual cycle essentially like a vital sign, like the same way we think of resting heart rate or HRV, that it's something that when we have a regular healthy menstrual cycle that's reoccurring regularly, that's following a similar pattern, that is an important aspect of health for our female athletes and our naturally menstruating female athletes. Okay, so now, of course, we got to go back to hormonal contraceptives because, again, that could be up to 50% of athletes, especially in certain countries. We see that even being higher. So how does this information apply to females who are on hormonal contraceptives? Do we see the same changes in performance? Do we see changes in training? And again, the answer is we don't necessarily know. So the first thing to think about with hormonal contraceptives, as we saw with that graph, is that there is a lot of different prescriptions and different options, especially within even one country and comparing country to country. We see huge variations in the levels of estrogen and progestin in those prescriptions. And so each one may have a different effect. And then, of course, each athlete may see different effects from different prescriptions. So it's very hard to say whether or not hormonal contraceptives increase or decrease performance because this may be very different from person to person. Now, in a meta-analysis that came out this year that looked at a huge variety of studies looking at hormonal contraceptives and looking at performance at different points and comparing that to those who did not take a hormonal contraceptive, which is, again, kind of our big comparison we always want to know, some did show potential slight for a decrease in performance. But it again was a trivial amount. And it is so hard to make a sweeping generalization to say that hormonal contraceptives will have one effect or the other, because it is so individualized. So if there's an athlete who is taking hormonal contraceptives because of extreme symptoms that they're getting during the menstrual cycle that they no longer have once they're on the hormonal contraceptives, we could probably assume that potentially their performance might go up, right? If they're no longer having these extreme symptoms. But then again, in an individual who starts taking hormonal contraceptives and finds that they're experiencing symptoms from taking that pill, their performance may be affected negatively. So it's very hard for us to make any sort of generalization. Again, it's the very individualized thing. One thing we do know, though, is that it's not recommended to have females take hormonal contraceptives simply to get some sort of athletic advantage. We want to make sure that athletes who are taking hormonal contraceptives are taking them for reasons that make sense for them and their body, and they're not being recommended to take them simply as a way to fix their period or fix some sort of concern about being on their period or having a natural menstrual cycle, as some athletes have been recommended to do that. Especially we see that in athletes with the relative energy deficiency in sport. Sometimes they're recommended to go on a hormonal contraceptive to reset their natural menstrual cycle. And we just don't really have any data on that showing that to be the case. And in fact, sometimes that may mask the problem that they're experiencing. Because when someone's on a hormonal contraceptive, we don't know if they're actually getting a normal natural period, because that masks that effect. All they're getting is a withdrawal bleed. And so we may not be aware that they're starting to get the symptoms of amenorrhea. So again, takeaway here is that hormonal contraceptives are very popular, but we really can't say whether or not across the board this will affect an athlete's performance. What we can say, though, is that at an individual level, it may increase or decrease their performance depending on their individual experience with it. Okay, so what do we do with all this information? What can we do for athletes, and how can we support them the best? And overall, it's taking an individualized approach. If that hasn't been said enough throughout this presentation, hopefully this really kind of brings that in and makes that clear, is that we just need to figure out what works for that individual athlete. If you're interested in having the athlete track their cycle, that may be the best way to figure out what is going to be the best training for them, when's going to be their best performance, is having them look for patterns at least 3 different menstrual cycles. And then we can really have someone design training for what works for that individual athlete, which is really what we probably should be recommending across the board, is to just figure out what's going to work for that individual athlete. If there are specific symptoms that are coming up, really we can address most of those symptoms with appropriate measures that are directed to that symptom. So if for some reason there's a concern in calorie intake, food cravings, or things like that, a nutrition focus, so either working with a sports registered dietitian, nutritionist, something like that, to find the best plan for that athlete and actually address that concern individually. If sleep is the biggest concern, working on sleep hygiene, so using the same principles that we would use across the board recommending sleep. So having a nice sleep schedule, making sure that we're giving sufficient time to relax, making sure working on things to clear the mind before sleeping, all of those normal tips that we would give someone, trying those steps first before taking large drastic measures. And then if some of the concerns are with mood or mental performance, of course, working with a sports psychologist, working with that psychological approach, because so much of someone's effect can be affected by their outlook, about their mental outlook. And especially if someone is concerned that at certain times of their cycle, they're not going to perform as well, making sure that they have the time to talk through that and make it through those mental barriers before they're up on that platform and before it's a time where it's really, really important. We need to make sure that we talk with them ahead of time to realize that they can do their best on any day and at any time. And then, of course, if there is a major concern, if we can't address anything, always referring to a healthcare professional, because, of course, we're all coaches and our background is in coaching in the sport and not necessarily in medicine. And that's totally okay. And so making sure we know when to refer out and refer to a specialist, especially someone with a background in sports medicine and women's health. Perfect. That is everything. Thank you so much, everyone. I'll pass it back over.
Thank you, Kimberly. We had some questions there that we're going to look at the end then in the Q&A session. And now we're going to move right straight forward to our second presenter. We have Kara Head Slaughter, and she is she's the head coach at CHFP, Kara Head's Fitness and Performance Master of Arts Olympian, USA Weightlifting International coach. And she will answer to those people wondering about what happens when women coach men. Kara, your turn.
Thank you so much, Carolina. And thank you, Kimberly, for that presentation. That was really insightful. I am excited to be here today with all of you and our attendees. So what I'll be focusing on today is women in coaching, and specifically women coaching men. A little bit about me. I live in Washington, D.C., and I run a Olympic weightlifting coaching business and an Olympic weightlifting competitive team. And I coach and instruct over 100 athletes or so a week, athletes and coaches. And I've had the privilege of serving as a coach to my athletes at the local level, regional level, and international level, national and international level. And I have been teaching courses for USA Weightlifting. I'm a coach course instructor for USA Weightlifting as well as IWF. And I also teach a 12-week coaches academy here in DC. And that project actually started with the vision of trying to incorporate more female coaches and recruit more female coaches to participate in the sport of Olympic weightlifting. And I've been doing that for about 5 years. All right, we will cover today, as I said, women in coaching. We'll touch a little bit on successes as well as challenges. And I do want to share the results of a survey that we sent out to coaches, not just in the US, but some of our coaching peers around the world were able to participate. So I want to share those answers with you because we discussed their thoughts on whether or not there are differences between coaching men and women. And then we will focus specifically on women coaching men. And then we'll finish with recommendations on women coaching men, women coach development, and organizational support for women coaches, because we can't do it on our own. All right, just real quickly, I wanted to highlight some incredible success stories in terms of female coaches who have been able to advance the ranks of sports that are male-dominated sports and have had a tremendous amount of success. So I just wanted to share some of those coaches' names with you if you're not familiar, and highlight one who's on our panel today, Meg Stone. And she was a head strength and conditioning coach for men and women at 2 major US universities, and the first woman to serve as a national track and field coach for Britain. And then also Ursula Garza Papandrea, who was the first US woman to become a USA Weightlifting Senior International coach, and the only US woman to coach a US men's team to a national championship. She has plays a large role in my decision to become a coach in the sport of weightlifting. I was an Olympian, but I wasn't sure about a path forward as a coach. And Ursula has been instrumental in supporting my development as a coach. So despite some of these inspiring examples, what's clear from the data is that there are barriers, more barriers than support that exist for women coaches. And so I just kind of want to take a look at how that happens. One way to explore that is through Title IX. So in the US, Title IX passed in 1972, and it basically transformed sports for the US. So it created equal opportunity for men and women in college to receive equal treatment and funding for their programs. what can we learn from Title IX? Even though Title IX created opportunities for female athletes, where it came up short is preparing opportunities for female coaches. And so basically, once those university students, female athletes, graduated, the opportunities also stopped. They were not being supported in their advancement from sport as an athlete to coaching sports. So essentially, without equal opportunities to lead, women don't lead. A little bit about our survey. We started with, well, let me back up. Most men and women coaches agree that to a degree, there are some differences in coaching men and women. However, some do not. Okay, we had a strength and conditioning coach here, as you can see, say, I coach the athlete and the person based on their individual abilities and needs, not their gender. I'm going to be very curious to hear some of the comments at the end about this, all of this. So the survey, as I said, covered a variety of coaches, both men and women, from different sports, variety of experiences, different time periods, settings, and age groups. Okay. And of all of our respondents, all of them, we had 23 respond, all of them have coached both men and women. Okay, and then the breakdown between male and female. And the experiences of our coaches as well. Given that this is an IWF webinar, we had 17 coaches that are actually weightlifting coaches and 6 that coach weightlifting and 6 that focus solely on weightlifting. And then we had some feedback from some track and field coaches, strength and conditioning, football, soccer, American football, and basketball. Okay, and just a little bit of data here on who responded so that you are informed about some of the responses that I'm going to share with you. Are there differences in how you coach women? This is what we were looking for. All right, 72.7 said yes. All right, that is something to keep in mind. And also 27% said no. And then we tried to create some categories to determine what the differences are in terms of how they coach men and women. So in terms of how they approach them, a psychological focus, that seemed to be the greatest, followed by physiological and sociological. All right, what I just want to highlight here is how coaches are saying that they coach men differently, since I wanted to focus on how women coaching men. So you'll see some comments in here about how the coaches also address young ladies and women, but I would like to focus on how they are coaching men and women differently, specifically men. So in this case, women often need to be encouraged to be more assertive after their social conditioning, while boys need to be encouraged to be calm and focused. Again, these are quotes from the survey, practices and opinions from coaches who are working right now. Okay, most men think they know it all and are all going to be pros. Women are more emotional than men, so a coach needs to be more sensitive in what is said. Confidence on the women's side is always lacking, on the men's side, not so much. Okay. Conflict resolution seems to be easier for men. Women internalize criticism if not constructive, while males tend to externalize. Interesting comments. Again, wish we could have an open discussion right now as these are coming through. All right. Specific methods used for coaching men and women differently: attention to menses or lack of. And another coach reports, we will purposefully address self-talk in women and girls to be positive and assertive, and self-talk for boys to be positive and geared towards focus rather than emotional lifting. Some of the research says that young ladies tend to lack confidence, where boys tend to be overconfident. And that could in some ways lend itself to this comment where if young males or male athletes are focused on or have a lot of confidence, they could become emotional in their lifting. It's all quite interesting. Okay. Men may lack this part down here about men may have the same lack of confidence, but mask it better. I thought that was really interesting because sometimes emotions, in my lived experience as a coach, I'm understanding that male and female coaches both have sometimes unspoken fear about or anxiety about what's getting ready to happen in their either training, a heavy training session, or in competition. And so if there is fear, it could express itself differently. It could be based on personality. It could be based on gender. It could be based on a lot of things. But if a woman is said to be emotional, it may express itself sometimes as tears, or it depends on the personality, because it also could be anger or intensity. And for men, sometimes even if there is a fear, what I find out later, they're concerned or fearful about their performance. What's actually happening in that moment is maybe they're cursing or throwing a belt or acting out in some way. But at the root of all of it, it might be that there's insecurity about performance. And sometimes women get the bad rap of being emotional, but the expression of the emotion is perhaps just different. And both genders are expressing themselves emotionally. It is just different. Okay. And we have some more. This one was interesting. Additional comments on differences in coaching men and women. Men quickly buy in once I give them a quick scientific education to rationalize our training. They then simply follow the plan without scrutiny. Okay. And a female coach here discussing from a coach point of view, standing close to a male athlete and having to show some technical issue by touching the body. I always warn the athlete that I will now touch your lower back. I don't do that with women. And again, a female coach, traveling competitions, weigh-ins, I give more space to the male athletes, especially since I can't get into the men's locker room. And this comment, this response from the survey kind of lends itself into some of the, I think, assumptions that female coaches may have, and even male coaches may have about their male athletes. So boys and men can sometimes have the mentality that women coaches aren't able to coach male athletes. And at the end of the day, if that bias is sitting there, we as coaches still need to coach the athlete. I think that it does depend on the environment, because if you're in a private business, you can choose who you coach and who you don't coach. If you are perhaps the head coach at an institution where you don't have as much autonomy to decide who is going to be on your team and who you will put off of your team, you're still then needing to, as a female coach, perhaps work around that bias. And if athletes are truly interested in getting better, which most athletes are focused on how they can improve, then they'll want to see evidence of how they can get better. And in my experience, even if a relationship with a male athlete starts out with them perhaps having a doubt about my capability to advance them, once they see that they are improving and they see how they will achieve their goals, usually it's the buy-in has been created and we're moving forward rather smoothly. So I'm thinking that with male athletes, as female coaches coaching male athletes, we just need to make sure that, like every coach, we're competent in our coaching skills. And when we're competent in the skills required to be a great coach, then we will have success coaching the athlete, male or female. And here a coach kind of stepped away from the question that we posed and said, I go off personality. You know, I'm not looking at whether it's a male athlete or a female athlete. They're really focusing in on the personality of the athlete. So they highlighted whether or not the athlete is aggressive or sensitive or a tendency towards perfectionism. And whether that is a male or a female, they're looking for those personality traits. And then if they see those, then they respond to the personality as opposed to whether or not it's a male or female athlete. So the coaches shared some recommendations. These are successful women coaches for women who want to coach men. Focus on connecting with your athletes and making them better, and that will solve almost all the problems. That goes back to what I was saying earlier about just creating a plan and a strategy for your athlete to be successful, male or female. And if there is a situation where you don't have buy-in from any athlete, male or female, there still has to be that part, that period of time where you're showing what you're capable of. You know, some athletes come in trusting you right off the bat, male or female, and others need to see evidence before before you create the buy-in. Either way, in my experience, from a coaching perspective, I'm interested in reaching the athlete and advancing them to the highest level that we can achieve. And the way that I personally go about doing that is figuring out what they need to improve and delivering on that, making a way for them to be successful. Okay. Realize you're still contending with a lot of misconceptions about what women are capable of as coaches. So be ready to contend with having to prove yourself and bear the burden of that doubt. Okay. And then build solid relationships with men. Oops, sorry to do that. Build solid relationships with men in the upper leadership roles. And that happens so much in my experience, that happens somewhat naturally, because being an Olympian and being in connection with a lot of the top coaches in the country and administrators in our country, it was built into that experience. But if you don't have that pathway to coaching, if that wasn't your experience prior to coaching elite competition, then what they're suggesting here, I absolutely agree with, because those relationships are going to give you the support that you need so that you can have difficult conversations to try to address some of the challenges of being a female coach in a male dominant profession. Okay. Recommendations by successful women for coaches who coach or want to coach men. For women who coach or want to coach men, excuse me. Project confidence and competence from the initial interaction. We all have doubts in our ability, but do not let this show in your initial interactions. Okay. Again, that's from a female coach from our survey. If you're just starting out, gain global knowledge in your specific sport. Meaning, talk the language of the sport you are working with, know the key players, know the trends in training. This will go a long way towards gaining buy-in with the men. And then develop a thick skin. It's going to be rough here and there. So you just can't let everything bother you. Okay, and then I wanted to highlight these recommendations for women who coach men. So this was not from our survey, but I thought this could be helpful also for our audience. So I wanted to include them along with the responses from our survey. So going back to this notion that, fact that athletes want to improve their performances. So focusing on improving competency in these following areas are important. Setting the vision and strategy. If you don't have a vision and a strategy for getting your athletes to their goal, it's going to show up. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to waste time. So it's important to set the vision and the strategy and make that known to your athlete. Communicate that. And then shaping the environment, plans, organizing personnel, recruiting staff. That's all important. In my business, running a coaching business, I am constantly recruiting staff, whether it's through the 12-week Coaches Academy or athlete coaches that express interest in some of the courses that I teach. It's important to continue to recruit staff and shape the culture and the environment that you want. And then building relationships and managing relationships, conducting practices and structuring competitions. Okay, read and react in competition, so making adjustments. We all know that you may have a plan going into competition, but the sign, I think, of a great coach is the ability to adjust to what's happening. So respond to what's actually happening there in competition and figure out plan B to help your athletes still have the most success they can achieve for that day. And then learning and reflecting. I'm a big proponent of reflection, and I recommend that for coaches to continue growing. Also, additional recommendations for women coaches. Decide early on to coach. I think one mistake that I made was that I waited a long time to make the decision to coach. And if you decide early on to coach, it can obviously help you advance because you can start at just taking information and gaining education. But I would say in terms of deciding to coach early on, I want to make that specific to female athletes, because if you are actually playing the sport, it's only going to make you a better athlete to understand a coach's perspective, not as a distraction, but to support your training. And so if you decide early on to coach while you're still training, you can apprentice coach. And as long as, if you could take on, find a mentor, you can also have that constant informal learning structure. And that will allow you to have the support that you need to advance. So the idea is to decide early on to coach, and then mentoring, find a mentor, and then you can transition from being an athlete to a coach rather smoothly. While you're training, you could shadow coach. That may not mean that you're actually programming or that you have anything to do with the vision or the strategy of the program. But as long as you're apprentice coaching, you can start to learn about how all these things are done. And meanwhile, still training, still competing. And then moving on to an assistant coach with more responsibilities, and then potentially a head coach or a master coach if that's what you desire. Okay, and recommendations for additional recommendations for women coaches, excuse me. Okay, talk about coaching and be an advocate for women entering and staying in the profession. So I remember, as I mentioned earlier, Ursula was one of my major influences in me becoming a coach. But she would talk about it, and she would give me opportunities to learn and invite me to experiences where it was either workshops or courses that she was teaching, maybe something someone else was teaching, but she was talking about opportunities where I could go learn how to be a coach, right? It's, even though I was an Olympian and I did the sport for 20 years and broke American records and, competed on 5 world teams, it's a different skill set to be a great coach. And if I aspired to be a great coach, then I still had to learn the skills to be a great coach. So she was trying to set me up to have success, and was continually talking about coaching opportunities. Encourage female athletes to consider the profession of coaching and provide opportunities. Advocate for respectful and equal media coverage of women's teams and women's coaches. And suggest 5 women for open coaching positions to the person doing the hiring, and invite 5 women you know to apply. A couple more. Educate yourself and other women about common barriers faced by women coaches in the workplace, and develop strategies for support and coaching. I discuss barriers with other coaches, and I feel empowered and heard by my federation when I want to express something that I've observed, and perhaps there's room to change it. And so having these conversations, educating yourself about the barriers and having the conversations about them is how we begin to change things for the better for women coaches. And then become aware, recognize, and critically analyze dominant narratives about coaches, coaching science, and coaching behaviors that privilege men. And do not blame yourself for the oppression of the experience. If you experience, if you're uncomfortable in a male, in a coaching situation, and you internalize that, or you take it to mean that you shouldn't be there, or that you're doing something you're not supposed to be doing, that's when it's helpful to have a mentor or a female coach to talk about those things and help you process through those, because it can be discouraging. When I first started coaching, I was one of the few female coaches in the warm-up room, and it was helpful. Although I had a lot of peers in my community, because I was an elite athlete coaching, and a lot of the coaches that I was with in the warm-up room were former athletes. It's still different. It's different. And so it helps to have that network of female coaches to discuss these sorts of experiences. And then questions to consider: recommendations for sport organizations to support women coaches. Do your policies reflect the voices of women coaches? Do your policies practically inform the development of women coaches? Are policies explicitly addressing organizational level barriers for women in coaching? Again, far more barriers than support exist for women coaches, so there must be intentional effort to get women to participate as leaders. And then a few more recommendations. Revise organizational policies for responsibilities towards non-discrimination. Allow for job sharing of coaching roles and duties, or a team co-coaching approach. So I see that in our model, where there are more women coaches in the US coming up the ranks, and we have the opportunity to consult with our head coaches in the US, and we're able to discuss our athletes' progress, have meaningful conversation around how an athlete, our plan for the athlete at the competitions, but we're not operating in a silo, right? Like, we can have conversations with other coaches. And I think that's important as we are being intentional about advancing women in the coaching ranks, and also recruiting new women into the profession of coaching. And then I just want to highlight the last one: create scholarships and apprenticeships for women coaches. That can be important and helpful. So I will leave you with that. Okay, and some of these are a little bit more focused on the male side. I have male coaches as allies. Be deliberate in identifying which men are invested in acting as allies, and enlist their help. I think that's really important, because we have so many male coaches. And so it's important to understand who is aligned and who can be helpful as we look to continue to recruit female coaches. And we will save questions for the end, as I understand. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kara. Yes, please go ahead and write your questions into the Q&A section there. And then we will go ahead, and our panelists are going to gather the questions, and we will look at them at the end and together. Okay, thank you, Kara. And we are going to move along in our program. Our next presenter comes with a Scottish accent, Olympian Meg Stone, Director of the Centre of Excellence for Sports Science and Coach Education. And I was reading from somewhere, and when you did that, Meg, I lost all my information. You can go ahead and pick it up from there, please. There was a lot of other stuff that you have that you have achieved, so I lost now that. Please take your own introduction.
Oh, sorry, Carolina. Really, my introduction, well, I'm Meg Stone. I'm director of our Centre of Excellence for Sports Science and Coach Education here at East Tennessee State University in the US. And I've probably coached more years than I can probably remember. So as Cara mentioned in her presentation, I coached at 2 major universities and actually here at ETSU more of an administrative role. So the first thing I want to do is thank you, Carolina, and the IWF for asking me to be part of this webinar. I'm flattered to be asked with both Cara and Kimberly, both very excellent presenters. So thank you for that. The subject of my talk is the training methodologies of women weightlifters. When considering the methods for women, there are good reasons to draw comparisons between men and women. There's an evolutionary base for comparisons. Males may be more suited for sport, both physically and emotionally, than, and the other question we have to ask is, are male-based programs really suited for female lifters? Another consideration is injuries. Females may have a higher potential for injury. And what specific injuries occur in weightlifting? And how do we actually address them? So genetically, considering genetics, there's substantially more genetic differences between women and men than just X and Y chromosomes. There are at least 6,500 gene differences between men and women. Let that sink in. 6,500 differences between men and women. What are some of these differences? Well, we're going to consider those differences by looking at muscle fiber type, the skeletal system, and hormonal considerations. In considering differences between men and women, there's little or no differences in muscle fiber. Females have smaller muscle mass and a smaller cross-sectional area. However, in the study by Serrano et al., they found that elite female weightlifters had a greater percentage of fast twitch fibers than national level male lifters. However, this would have been more meaningful if the elite level women had been compared with the elite level men. And this is the first study to find such a finding. Generally, females are weaker than males and women generate less power. In the upper body, women are between 40 to 60% weaker. And in the lower body, somewhere around 25%. These values may justify the female lifter focusing on strength development in the upper body. Rate of force development is typically lower than in men. Lower level athletes show greater sex differences than elite level athletes. And we'll come back to that theme throughout this presentation. Okay, moving on. Compared to women, men have relatively more muscle mass in the upper body And conversely, women have relatively more muscle mass in the lower body. Another reason to attend to developing the upper body in your female lifter. More differences. Women are generally shorter, smaller, and have a shorter limb length with a carrying angle which may present a potential for injury, particularly in overhead support movements. And I'll revisit that again later in this presentation. Males have a greater hip to shoulder ratio than females. And again, the female may have relatively more muscle mass in the lower body with a lower center of gravity. These facts provide both advantages and disadvantages for weightlifting. And again, differences are smaller as the athlete level increases. Endocrine system differences. At rest, men have 5 to 10 times more the androgen concentrations of women. High concentrations of testosterone are genetically related in both men and women. Women athletes, particularly strength power athletes, tend to have more higher testosterone concentrations than non-athletes. Testosterone can produce some very unwanted and troublesome symptoms. In women, as you can see listed here, of interest is the increased muscle mass and changes in body shape. Let's now consider force generating capabilities of women compared to men. Women generate less absolute and relatively less power. The rate of force development is typically lower in women. And again, lower level athletes show greater sex characteristic differences than elite athletes. In this 2001 study of elite level weightlifters found that female lifters in the snatch lifted approximately 68% of their male counterparts. And in the clean and jerk, it was between 63% and 68%. Approximately 20 years later, in 2019, an analysis that we conducted showed over these 3 class averages, we found that there was little difference in the snatch and a slight improvement in the clean and jerk. This review cited below by Hilton, cited below came to the same conclusions as we did. So, resistance training, just as beneficial to women as it is to men. Women can gain strength at the same relative rate as men, depending on the commitment from both. Okay, possible explanations for all of the differences we've previously discussed. Genetics definitely, and physiological differences play a role. There may be cultural implications involved. There is a need for much further research, but training status definitely plays a strong role. Let's look at training considerations for the female athlete, or the female weightlifter specifically. In Hackenen's study here, he found after 3 to 5 months of heavy weight training, gains may plateau in your female lifter. This suggests again, maybe a need for variation in the training program, and specifically for women. There are also socio-psychological aspects to the interaction between coach and athlete to consider. The behavior of the coach in terms of role conflict, self-esteem, and the coach's ability to empower the athlete plays a role in professionalism of the coaching environment. Issues such as dropout rates, understanding drug and sex tests, the role of the media in promoting the sport for women, and giving equal opportunities to train and compete for all women in all weight classes. All of these things can have an effect on the performance of the women weightlifter. So, in building your training process, there are several things you need to consider. Number one, genetics and epigenetics, and we have talked a little bit about that previously. The importance of developing strength, the importance of athlete monitoring, the selection of a good training model, and importantly, recognizing, as has been stated in previous presentations, how important it is to recognize there will be individual variations. Here we see many factors that affect sport performance. Probably the most important and most impactful is hereditary, followed by the training program. All of these factors will have an effect on the athlete's ability to adapt and recover and to that training process. So, some things that must be not underestimated is the ability to develop maximum strength. Here you can see a list of many factors that are influenced and may rely upon maximum strength development. Also important not to underestimate and to understand is the importance of incorporating and developing strength training prior to power training, as maximum strength potentiates power and explosiveness. So we cannot underestimate the ability just to get really strong before we move into power programs. So we address athlete monitoring from two aspects. The first one is fatigue management. The second is program efficacy. Is your program working, and is it working as it should, when it should? Athlete monitoring can be done at two levels. It can be done at your micro level or your macro level. At a micro level, that involves the session monitoring. At the macro level, at specific times throughout your whole training process. Fatigue management is often incorporated at the micro level, using tools such as RPE, questionnaires, etc. Program efficacy is more typically measured throughout your whole training process to monitor factors such as maximum strength, explosiveness, or power levels. For all to be effective, they've all got to be built into your annual plan. So, what does the training process look like? Please don't be intimidated by all these blocks. It's very straightforward. Now we come to consider that overall training process. Periodization is recognized as a superior method of organizing and reorganizing the training process. We use block periodization rather than the traditional Matveyev model. Block periodization tends to fit the competitive schedule in a superior manner. Periodization and programming are essential elements of building an annual plan. Periodization is a method of organizing timelines and fitness phases. Program refers to the exercise selection and reps and sets being used within these timelines. These timelines and phases are constructed within the annual plan. Also within the annual plan and the fitness phase is organized individual periodized blocks of training, referred to as here accumulation, transmutation, and realization. Together with an active recovery, this is referred to as one stage of training. Slide 22 refers here to the importance of understanding the criteria of each of these blocks and how they build one upon the other. beginning with the accumulation, the focus of which is strength endurance with a focus on basic strength. In this phase, we'd have a greater percentage of partial movements, with reps and sets appropriately building on work capacity. As we move through the transmutation into realization, the task specificity increases. In your transmutation, there is an emphasis on specific strength.
You want to take a little break, Meg?
No, I'm okay. Go, Carolina.
Okay.
I'll come through. Here we go.
Yeah.
As we move from realization, the emphasis moves to power development.
Meg, we can go ahead and take a couple of questions in between if you wanted to just take a little break.
No, I'm okay. I can go.
Okay.
It's important to point out that strength and power are worked at all times through your training program. One is emphasized over the other, depending on the block that you have that you're working with. Okay. Here we have an example of a stage of training with a concentrated load of strength training and strength endurance work, leading into a basic strength phase, followed by a phase of power emphasis. So, using block periodization, we'll consider variations for women. Interestingly, in this survey of Russian and Ukrainian coaches, it produced information regarding women weightlifters. 80% of coaches observed emotional and mental challenges in working with their female lifters. Almost 29% noticed an increase in aggressiveness and rudeness as the training program progressed. 93% of those coaches did not control for any aspect of the menstrual cycle, and only 2% of those coaches even kept any record of the menstrual cycle. So again, considering injuries, cycling back, considering injuries. Although ACL injuries are not common in weightlifting, they do happen. And here you can see potential causes. The main reason appears to be lack of strength. In weightlifting, moving and landing foot positions must be addressed, as some women tend to be asymmetrical. Teaching and how to land and landing mechanics in snatch and clean and jerk would be important. Other injuries to consider are overuse injuries, a reason to carefully monitor the training process. There appears to be a high incidence of lower body injuries in women, and they tend to be circled round about the ankle. Some studies draw attention to the elbow. Some studies show attention to the elbow. Again, because of this carrying angle, it presents a challenge, as I previously mentioned, in overhead support, such in the snatch and the clean and jerk. The lower part, the lower back seems to be an area of weakness, which if it's not addressed, can lead to injury. In discussion with our women weightlifters here at ETSU at our university, all of them mentioned lower back weakness during menstruation. Another factor they mentioned was coping with fatigue, cramping, general aches and pains, and emotional frustration during menstruation. Several of them mentioned the dissipation of these symptoms when they used birth control. None of these women needed any adjustment of the training load during menstruation. So let's consider alterations in the training program due to the menstrual cycle. Presented here will be several scenarios which depend upon individual menstruation. But here we have a normal, what I'm calling a normal menstrual cycle. And I know Kimberly has pointed out how that menstrual cycle can last right up to 32 days. Please note the black line in particular here, with the raise in the peak in testosterone during ovulation. This could play a role in the manipulation of the training program. In the 1970s, early research suggested the best physical performance could happen between the end of menstruation and the 15th day of the cycle. Not all coaches and researchers agreed with that suggestion. Then again, in the 1990s, another study sought to take advantage of the peak in testosterone during, and you can see here, during ovulation, a peak in the training load, tapering off after ovulation, and again, a lower load during menstruation. Further suggestions for changes in workloads and intensities done on an individual basis are as follows. We have light week and intensive week, light week during menstruation, and intensive week during post-menstruation. Moving on to the ovulation phase, a moderate week followed by an intensive week. Again, lower down here below, you can see lighter loads followed by 2 intensive weeks and a moderate week. Both very interesting manipulations of loading, particularly in an individual athlete. The female athlete triad, as mentioned previously, it does not seem to be typically encountered in weightlifting. It may be found in the lighter weight classes, or if an athlete's attempting to lift in a class they're not well genetically suited for. So, shown here is a prolonged accumulation phase, which could be used in a beginner or an intermediate lifter. We see here a period of concentrated load with an unload, concentrated load with an unload week for recovery. 2 of these blocks in succession allow time to develop the upper body and strength levels in the beginner or intermediate lifter. Revisiting the menstrual cycle. Individual variations, as have been discussed previously. Not every athlete or female lifter is going to have a problem with the menstrual cycle, but it's not well studied. It is beginning to be studied in the US and of course with Kimberly in New Zealand. I know the Chinese have looked at this quite closely. Key factors to consider in the menstrual cycle are things like intensity of training, duration of training, the volume of training, and early age. And when that athlete first begins to menstruate, were they training before their first period? That could lead to menstrual irregularities such as amenorrhea. Okay, in a 4-week block, here we see we can depend on where that menstrual cycle falls or where that menstruation falls as noted by the blue blocks here, adjustments can be made as these blocks indicate a week of lighter loads. And of course, this first typical progression, you would have a lighter load in the first week anyway, in a concentrated load. You would build, and then in that fourth week in recovery, that may be when you are menstruating, when there's menstruation involved. And in these other two blocks, the blue block would be an adjustment for menstruation. Interesting variations to consider if you have issues with the menstrual cycle. So, in summary, the primary difference between men and women appear to be size-based. There should be few differences in the weight training program for women compared to men. There are also differences that are worth attending to and should be addressed in specific individuals. That goes for men and women, but specifically with women. In the beginning lifter, that general preparation phase, the accumulation phase, may have to be longer. It would provide preparation for participating at a higher level of competition. More emphasis may need to be placed on the upper body levels due to that physiological and biomechanical considerations. And then overhead injuries can be reduced because of paying attention to these issues. Due to the prevalence of knee injuries, particularly ACL injuries, more emphasis may have to be placed on the lower body strength levels depending on individual needs. Again, that's not a major problem in weightlifting. Hackenen's study suggested the need for variation in the weightlifting program of female athletes, particularly at the elite level and particularly in the upper body. And the individual differences found by carefully recording and documenting idiosyncrasies noted during the detailed recording of the menstrual cycle. It has been noted also that several weightlifting coaches anecdotally support block periodization as it may be very well suited to the female with menstrual cycle challenges. Takeaway message: coaches working with female weightlifters should investigate, take note of idiosyncrasies that may manifest themselves in their female lifters. And again, much more research needs to be done on an individual basis with each lifter that coach is working with. Okay, here's my contact details. Please feel free to contact me at any time. Happy to respond. And Carolina, apologies for the coughing and spluttering. It just caught my throat. Apologies.
Thank you.
It didn't damage any of the presentation.
No. Thank you very much for your presentation. And now we have some question and answers that we have. So Meg, now that you're done, if you go ahead and click on that Q&A, and our presenters are now going to choose themselves some of the questions that they will answer. So we'll do so that Kimberly or Kara, if you guys will start, so Meg also gets a chance to look through those questions in the Q&A section. Can you find them, Meg, there? Click on it and you can find them? Yes. So think about which ones you want to answer. We'll just take a couple. And so who wants to go first? Kimberly?
I can start, yeah.
Okay. Kimberly's going to choose a question that was sent in and she's going to answer it. Thank you.
Okay, so there's a few repeats on a few questions. So I'm going to combine a few people's questions into one. A few of them were surrounding the irregularities that I talked about, which were more common in female athletes than in the sedentary individuals. And one person asked if that had to do with body fat levels, which is a really great question. A lot of people have hypothesized that in the past, that it does have something to do with body fat levels. But we do see these irregularities in individuals that do have higher body fat levels as well, even if they are active but still have higher body fat levels. So it's a little bit hard to say that that's necessarily the cause. What we do see though across the board is that it could be connected to insufficient calorie intake, that might have something to do with irregularities, and that there's some things that we just don't totally understand with the commonality of those irregularities. So great question on that one. There's a few questions about iron and iron supplementation, especially with the concept of bleeding, iron loss during menstruation. And that's, again, totally going to depend on the individual. So first things first, with the questions surrounding nutrition, I don't have a strong background in nutrition. That's not my field, but I can give some general information on this. So with iron supplementation due to the menstrual cycle, typically the recommendation is to have someone visit a healthcare provider before telling them to take iron supplements, just because there is the risk that some people do not need the iron supplement, and that extra iron could actually make them really sick. It could actually have detrimental results taking iron if you don't need it. So rather than just telling someone to take iron just because they have their period or are menstruating more, it's much more important to actually go to a healthcare provider and have that checked out first, and then based on their recommendation decide whether or not iron supplementation might be needed. Okay, and then a few other questions came up with that utilization of different substrates. So with using fat versus carbohydrates versus protein in different parts of the menstrual cycle. So everyone loves to kind of find this out. Well, if I eat the right way, will that fix these menstrual cycle problems? Will that fix the irregularities? And again, it totally depends, because when we think about all those different types of hormonal profiles that we see in our athletes, it's really hard to make a recommendation across the board that this type of nutrition intervention will work for everyone. So again, there's not really a sweeping statement that we can say that, oh, all females in this part of their cycle will need extra protein or will need extra carbohydrates. What we do know is that progesterone does increase our fat utilization, and it also does seem to be catabolic to protein. So some have made the recommendation to increase protein intake during the time that someone is higher in progesterone. But again, I would talk to a nutritionist or registered dietitian first before making big changes to someone's diet based on where they are in their menstrual cycle. Perfect. Okay, that wrapped up the questions that I saw directed towards me.
Okay, thank you, Kimberly. So, Kara, are you ready? Okay, unmute yourself.
There we go. I'm back. Okay. Okay, I have a few questions here. One coach asked, do you think that women have to mimic existing masculine archetypes of coaches? Or do you see an emerging, more feminine style of coaching?
Cara, we've lost your audio.
Is this better?
Yes, great.
Thank you for the audio coaching. All right. All right. Should I repeat the question? Did you hear the question? Okay, I'll repeat the question. All right. Do you think that women have to mimic existing masculine archetypes of coaches, or do you see an emerging, more feminine style of coaching as equally effective? I personally don't think that a woman coach needs to mimic an existing male archetype, masculine archetype. And what's I found really interesting about this question is when I was younger and contemplating what my career would be as I was a weightlifter, I thought to myself, I might not be a great coach because I'm not aggressive. But what I learned along the way is it's more about being assertive than needing to be aggressive. And kind of once I made that distinction, I started to feel as though I could be my more kind of friendly, softer personality and still be quite effective, as many of my athletes have made international competitions and won medals in international competitions. And so that's what I'm thinking about that one. Somebody else asked, would you recommend holding female-only sessions? And I think there's value in holding female-only sessions when you can gather women together, like this forum, and you can get women together experiencing weightlifting and just enjoying the sport. I definitely think there's value to that, and the research actually says that is one recommendation. So I think that works. I didn't have that opportunity so much coming up in the sport because where I was living and growing up in Southern California, Orange County, starting the sport back in 1991, 93, I was in a football weight room with the football team. So it was myself and my sister, so my experience coming up, I didn't have that, but I know that some women are more comfortable in those types of settings. So if you can create it, I recommend doing so. And then maybe one more, and I'll pass. Okay, what was your hesitation to pursue a career in coaching for the US? So when I was a weightlifter, a competitive elite weightlifter, I somehow made an assumption that I wouldn't fit, like I wouldn't belong in the fraternity of coaches. And I think I made those assumptions because nobody looked like me in the coaching ranks at that time. So all men, no coaches of color that I remember. So I thought to myself, I should probably choose a career where I think I'll fit in. And I never challenged these ideas in conversation with anyone else. They just came up as a result of what I was looking at and trying to figure out if I would fit. And so that was my hesitation in pursuing the career. And then again, with encouragement and coaches saying, hey, come here and try this, do this camp with me, just come and coach this camp with me, see if you like it. Those types of opportunities and encouragement along the way just made me think a little bit differently. And I'll also add that something that was instrumental too was that the explosion of CrossFit here in the US created a huge demand where women working with barbell movements now wanted coaching. So I had a female audience, I was interested in teaching it. And that opportunity made me think, okay, I belong here. I think that's what I did in my head, again, without discussion. I think I belong here. And so that also helped me kind of turn the corner and come to weightlifting. So I think forums like this are really important so that women can see other female coaches, engage in these conversations with us, and make choices to participate in the profession of coaching.
Okay, thank you, Kara. Is Meg ready to pick up some questions?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
I have one question here. Meg, can you speak to changes in response to training between women who have been pregnant and those who have not? This could be a team tag between myself and Kimberly, if she has anything to add to it. I do know there are women who have won gold medals during pregnancy. I can think of two offhand who have competed at a very, very high level. And I think you can continue to train well into pregnancy. After pregnancy, I would suggest that getting back into training, you have to go right back down into that beginner intermediate level type of training program in order to regain fitness and get back into an elite level, elite fitness kind of category, you have to take it very slowly, get back into training. But I do know I've actually coached a young lady who was pregnant and continued to lift and run right into about the 4th or 5th month of pregnancy. And in fact, I know a middle distance runner who ran right up to the 9th month and was fine. So Kimberly, maybe you can help me out here with that, given that there's so much hormonal considerations in pregnancy.
Meg, I think you summarized that really well. I think it really varies from individual to individual. And as we've seen a lot more on social media, right, we can follow people documenting their lives and sharing all this information with us. So there's been quite a few athletes that have actually posted, working out throughout their pregnancy. But again, that's something that is completely different from person to person and definitely needs to be talked with their doctor and gone over. And even after pregnancy, because that's going to vary a lot with how childbirth went for them, will really affect when they're going to be able to return to training, how long their recovery may take. So yeah, definitely totally individual, but many women can, return fairly quickly within, a year or so, can be training at high levels again, but totally depends. But always, great options to stay fit during pregnancy and then go back to their sport afterwards.
Mm-hmm. I think that's an important thing to note too, that the more elite level athlete and the higher training levels you were at before pregnancy, the quicker you will come back after pregnancy. Yeah, I think that's an interesting point to note. Other question I have? I don't think I have another question, Carolina. I've just got a lot of thank yous.
There was one I spotted actually, Meg. Someone asked what the difference in percentage range is for the intensity block and the periodization method. So what's the different, obviously you talked about the different intensities. Is there a percentage range that should work in? You're muted. You could unmute yourself, Meg.
Sorry, could you repeat that, Sarah? I didn't hear.
Yeah, so what is the percentage range of increase for intensity in the block periodization method?
I don't understand that question.
I think it's talking about, you talk about the drop off in intensity during the period, during menstruation.
Oh, you mean the volume?
Yeah,
the volume load?
Yeah.
Obviously, your intensity and volume would probably drop together in that week where there's involved with menstruation.
Is there a number to that, I think is the question that you'd put to it?
Obviously, when you're considering numbers to throw out percentages, you'd be looking at lesser percentage, round about 60 to 65% of the workload you've been working at. And then when you're working back into a higher level, 80 to 85 to 90% of the load. Really, it's much dependent upon your individual block and your actual stage of training. I couldn't answer that on an individual basis. Really, that's a difficult question to answer. It just means you would see a definite decrease in the intensity. Does that make sense?
Could I just ask, as a continuous on that basically when we're looking at, if we're looking at fatigue and you have your nervous system and we start at 70% of the max, that's when we start working also our nervous system. But if we're working below loads of 70%, so then we're more in the hypertrophy system for the muscle buildup. So would that be something that one would have to really to avoid the fatigue of the nervous system, because 80% you're working the nervous system. Then you go down below 70% into the 60s that you were talking about. That if that's the key, one of the keys there to for recovery, to let the nervous system recover.
It's true.
Meg, you're muted.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I think that's probably true, Carolina, but your nervous system, really, we're considering volume load at that point having an effect on the menstrual cycle and the symptoms that you are experiencing. So really, it's the volume load that you want to drop and consider during that time. Does that make sense? Yeah. You will, of course, be considering the nervous system in doing that. You're not really, shall we say, stimulating the nervous system the way you would if you were at higher percentages. But really, it's volume load you wanted to consider at that time in order to give that athlete the potential to work through the symptoms they may be experiencing with menstruation. That makes sense? Yes, to me.
There's just one further question actually for Meg.
It's a very, it's like Kimberly was talking, it's a very, very difficult subject just to put your thumb on the nail, because it's so variation, so individual dependent, that to give definite percentages, you need, like I said at the end of my presentation, it needs to be tracked day to day to day to day throughout your whole cycle, probably on a 3 to 6 month basis, to get your handle on percentages. And that's what's not done so often. We don't do that. But if you do the advantages, you would know this is when I need to drop the load. This is when my intensity and load need to be manipulated. Would you agree with that, Kimberly?
Yeah, definitely. I think it would be hard to say to one, yeah, depending on the type of training that they're doing, yeah, whether it's a hypertrophy focus or whether they're in their strength focus or they're peaking just before a competition, that's all going to really affect the amount we're going to change their percentage during their deload. But again, like, you know, it's so individualized. I feel like I've used that word so many times today, but, you know, looking from, again, depending on what type of hormonal profile that athlete has, is going to be different, what is going to work well for them training wise, for sure. You know, you might have some athletes that really do train their absolute best at the very beginning of their cycle. And so it doesn't really make sense just because some other athlete doesn't train well then to adjust that athlete's program the same way. So I think it's really like our job as the coach to really look at our athlete and say what works for them and what doesn't, rather than saying, well, I see that this is supposed to work for you, and so we're going to do it anyway. So I think it's really, that's where we come in. That's where the human factor of coaching comes from, is to really individualize what we're doing for that athlete.
I would wonder and question, we have a lot of coaches on this webinar. How many of those coaches actually sit down with a pen and paper or a laptop or whatever and record the actual feelings of that athlete day to day to day, as far as the menstrual cycle is concerned, how they're actually responding to training physically and taking note, because that would be such a valuable part of understanding your athlete and really knowing how to apply the training program to that athlete.
Yes, I don't know if we can make questions, but I did have one. I just a thought of for Kimberly, when you talked about the high hormone phase, and that's of course what we want. And when you look at the 21-day cycle versus the 35, so I guess I have two questions. Is that if you have a 35-day cycle, is your high hormone phase going to be longer? Or is it still exactly the same length as the person who has a 21-day cycle? And
yeah,
then
great
the second
question.
and then the second question follow up on that would be that let's start looking for the women who have a 21-day cycle and put that into the criteria of becoming a strength weightlifter. Because they're going to hit high hormone phase more during their lifetime.
Well, and again, though, because for some athletes, actually their high hormone phase, they actually might feel like a little bit more flat too. So it's kind of hard to say that that's when everyone will be performing well, because some actually might really feel better in that follicular phase. But okay, so the way it kind of shifts over. So if you have someone with a 21-day cycle versus a 35-day cycle, so looking at the two extremes, for the most part, it's the follicular phase that's longer in the longer cycle, and the luteal phase stays similar in length. On average, when we look at data from 600,000 cycles, we see that the luteal phase, even though the follicular phase changes quite a bit in length, the luteal phase stays around 12 days. Again, though, in someone's a 21-day cycle, it could be less than that. It could only be like an 8-day time. And in our longer cycles, a little bit longer. But again, it's typically the follicular phase that changes, which basically means that the ovulation is getting pushed back. So essentially that their body is in that just getting ready for ovulation stage for longer than someone who's in that shorter cycle, where they're just repeating the cycle again more and more frequently. And yeah, so I would say that it just depends so much from person to person. You might have some athletes that actually feel really, really good at that low hormone phase and not as good at the high hormone phase, because that's when they're really experiencing actually some of their worst symptoms. And then you have some of their reverse that feel the best, just at ovulation and just after. And it's some that just don't notice a difference at any point across their cycle.
Oh, was I muted? Okay, thank you, Kimberly. So were there any interesting questions that we should take right now? Are we ready to start wrapping up?
There was just one final one that'd be interesting. Someone asked whether you would train a premenopausal female and a postmenopausal female any differently. I guess that comes between Meg and Kimberly. I'm not sure which one.
Yeah,
maybe both.
I can start with that a little bit. I do know that when we're looking at postmenopause, so obviously we have a huge drop in hormones, right? That's signifying going into menopause, is when we have that decline in the ovaries producing their hormones. And so if we're thinking about changing performance and changing training based on someone's hormones, hypothetically, we would say, yes, we should change their training. We should make this adjustment. But if we think there's limited research on menstrual cycle based training, there's even less research looking at postmenopausal women across the board, nutrition wise, training wise, everything like that. There's just not that much information. But if we're thinking about this, very hypothetically with someone, if we're training based on their menstrual cycle and then they go through menopause, they no longer have that menstrual cycle. They no longer have those ebbs and flows of estrogen and progesterone. We can't really base training then on the hormone cycle, right? Because that's gone away. Meg, do you want to kind of take some more of that?
Yeah, about the post menopause, I think it's really important that if you are a coach, you encourage whatever female athlete you're working with to continue to weight train through their whole life, because obviously osteoporosis becomes an issue. And we know that weight training is a huge advantage to anybody who has the potential for osteoporosis. So to strengthen and weight bear and strengthen the ends of the long bones is very important. Also, you can retain more muscle mass if you keep training throughout your whole life. I think osteoporosis and muscle mass retention is really important. You want to be able to open that can of orange juice when you're 70. So you keep weight training throughout your whole life.
I think that's a great one to end on. We need to continue strength training through our whole our lives. I want to thank our presenters. Thank you. This was exciting. First ever webinar for all of us. So we survived. We were a little bit stressed, but it went excellent. And I also want to thank the IWF for supporting us, the Women's Commission, so that we can continue working for women's weightlifting. One thing that we don't really know right now is we don't know exactly how many female weightlifting coaches we have in the world. And that's something we're working on, a database to collect, not just for women coaches, but for all coaches into the IWF system, so that we can keep a track of who we have and be able to work better together and take our sport forward, scientifically based. So I would like to thank everyone for participating, our participants, and hope to see you guys soon. Good weightlifting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Carolina.
Bye.
So much.
Bye.